A new poll from Clean Energy Canada shows keen interest in buying electric vehicles. This is especially true of younger Canadians who live in cities like Montreal and Vancouver. British Columbia and Quebec continue to lead in EV adoption, but new data from S&P Global Mobility shows strong headwinds in the short term. Zero-emission vehicle share of Canadian new car sales dropped from 18.9% in the fourth quarter to 9.7% in the first quarter of 2025. There are a number of reasons for the slowdown. Pauses in federal and provincial EV rebates. An economic slowdown has consumers pinching their pennies, especially on big-ticket items after U.S. President Donald Trump began his tariff trade war in January. And a shortage of EV models in the lower end of the market. Legacy automakers continue, for the most part, to make premium battery electric vehicles, unlike China, which focused on modestly priced EVs from the beginning. Historically, most new technology adoption has peaks and valleys. I spoke to Trevor Melanson about Clean Energy Canada's survey, which was conducted with 2,585 Canadians from June 2nd to June 5th by Abacus Data. Welcome to the interview, Trevor.
Thanks for having me, Marco.
Now, this is really interesting because when Canada applied the 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, that was last year, last September, and the United States was seen as very much as a partner in developing a North American EV industry. And now we've been subjected to tariffs from US President Trump. It's a completely different game. Within this context, give us an overview of your survey.
Sure. Well, we wanted to see how much people actually like the 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. We'd actually done a separate survey. We hadn't released testing that question a few months ago and saw a result that suggested it wasn't particularly popular. And especially now, post-Trump, we wanted to ask that question nationally. And it was really important to construct that question properly. You don't want to force people into a false binary. So, you can have 100% tariff, you can have absolutely no tariff, or you can have something in between. It could be something like what Europe has, which is tariffs ranging from 8 to 35%, depending on the automaker. Or you could have something else that's uniquely Canadian. But you need to present that middle option. Otherwise, people will herd to one category that may not reflect how they actually feel about it. And
Right.
certainly, we've generally advocated at Clean Energy Canada a more balanced approach. And so that option of having a smaller, more European style tariff was by far the most popular, and over half of respondents said they preferred that. And interestingly, only 19% wanted to keep the current tariff in place. More people wanted to scrap it outright. So, I mean, 19% is pretty low level of support for a currently existing policy.
And I gather that there wasn't much difference between voters of the political parties.
No, no, actually, that probably surprised me a little bit, where it was like just a few percentage points, even among conservative voters, I think support for keeping 100% tariff in place was just a little over 20%. So it's not really, I've definitely seen more polarized questions in this one.
Trevor, one of the other options that you presented respondents was if Canada could open up its car market and allow for any vehicle that's passed safety and environmental standards in Europe, what was the response to that question?
Yeah, so that idea I got, it was a great Globe and Mail column from Matt Bubbers wrote a few weeks back, and unpacking that because the Dealers Association here in Canada has actually advocated before as something that is apparently quite feasible to do. So we've historically aligned our standards with America. But it's not necessarily the case we have to do that. I think Mexico, for example, accepts cars that are sold that are past standards in Europe. So, and the reason for doing that as well is because if a vehicle needs to be certified in Canada, it costs like millions of dollars. So it's really cost prohibitive if it's not basically automatically certified here in Canada. So we wanted to test that idea. I feel Canadians are pretty warm to Europeans right now, and the idea of it seems kind of like a no regrets policy. Let's just give people more consumer choice from, an ally that we all really like. And so support for that was 70%. And I think just as telling is the opposition to it was only 10%.
Let's talk about how many Canadians want to buy EVs because this has been a big story since the beginning of last year. You know, that's demand for EVs is softening, and that's certainly true in the U.S., but it's certainly not true in places like China and other parts of Asia. So, what are Canadians' attitudes towards EV purchases?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for adding that context because yes, it's true that globally, we're expecting 1 in 4 car sales to be electric this year. In 1 in 5 last year, Canada's actually trailing the global average. So people who are inclined to get an electric vehicle as their next car is at 45% right now, and that is a 13-point decrease from when we asked it in 2022. Um, and which obviously we prefer that not to see a decrease there. I think there are a couple of reasons for it. And then I'd also point to the fact that it's when you look down at the sort of breakdowns of different regions and different age groups, you see very different stories in that data. So on the first point, I think it's probably a mix of economic anxiety and yeah, the spread of EV misinformation, which I think people are quite aware of. But on that first point, I mean, we're at a time right now where people are economically insecure. And when you're economically insecure, I think you're less likely to want to spend more money on something, even if you know that thing might save you money down the road. That other survey that we haven't published yet is very interesting. 6 in 10 people, we've actually pulled that a few times. 6 in 10 people know an EV will cost them less over time, but many people are even knowing that are still not willing to spend more money upfront to get one. So I just think in the same way that people are not buying as many houses right now, people are just less could be less inclined to spend more money on something. Yeah, it may save them money down the road, but they're worried about money right now. So I think that's probably part of the reason. And yeah, I think there's been a rise of EV misinformation. But what I will say, majorities in BC and Quebec still want EVs. And in that regional survey work we did, in Vancouver, it was like almost 7 in 10 people preferred to get an EV as their next car. And similarly, people under the age of 30 and even under 45, again, those are solid majorities who want to go electric. There's a pretty big age gap.
That's really interesting on the age gap because, in my experience, it's actually older consumers that are buying cars because they can afford the additional upfront cost. And
Yeah.
we live in Parksville, BC, which has a lot of retired people, and that's who you see driving electric cars. They're the younger consumers, not so much. And I wonder if that obviously doesn't translate into places like Vancouver and Toronto and Quebec and so on. But what do you have any idea of what the percentages are for, consumers over 45?
For over 45, it's 40%, and for over 60, it goes down to 36%, in contrast with 57% for people under the age of 30. But I do want to get to that point you said about, you often see folks that are older driving cars, and they're the ones who have, not just wealth or whatever, but likely garages. And we do know home ownership, especially detached or semi-detached home ownership is going to be a lot higher among people that are older. That's part of the work that we're going to release in September, where we actually created segments, did a segmentation of adopters across the GTHA in Vancouver, and we want to identify the fact that not all adopters are the same. And so what you see with younger folks is like a high willingness and a high level of interest in getting an electric vehicle, but higher levels of structural barriers because many of them rent. And so they don't have any autonomy over their garage, where they park their car, if they even have a place to park their car, or they live in condos and face, a lot of similar barriers. And so when you're actually thinking about how do we make sure that more young people can get electric cars, you need to start thinking about, well, maybe we need to update building codes so that certainly when we're building new buildings that they're coming charge ready. We also need to support retrofits in condo buildings. Maybe we need community charging hubs, not just in highways, but in areas where a lot of renters and condo dwellers live. And we need to be careful with income caps. Like this happened in BC. BC's EV rebate is on pause, as I'm sure you know. And we've been critical of an adjustment they made to it, where basically if you had an individual income over $80,000, you could no longer get the full rebate. And the average that was lower than the average income for basically people between the ages of about like 25 and 50 who are working full time. So take your like full-time working parents who are struggling to buy their first townhouse in a city like Vancouver, and they're told they're too rich to get this incentive. But folks who are, let's say, older on average, who are equity rich, maybe not always, but in many cases, but have lower incomes, qualify for the rebate. So there are a lot of ways in which we structurally actually disincentivize access to electric vehicles for younger people who are the most inclined to get them. So having a lens that actually takes that into account could, I think, help us design better policy that targets the people who want to get these cars.
Well, Trevor, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Marco.